Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, it transformed New York City into a hub of international trade, drove the rise of industrial cities like Rochester, and accelerated the westward expansion of the United States. But, as we will learn from Mark Ferrara today, few of the laborers who toiled on the canal shared the prosperity that it brought. We are really delighted to have Mark here with us today. And today's program is presented by the Office of Rochester and Monroe County History, the Rochester Institute of Technology's History Department, and RIT Press, also in partnership with the local History and Genealogy Division of the Rochester Public Library. Together, we jointly publish the Rochester History Journal, and I would like to thank our partners at RIT for making today's event possible. Please be sure to stop at RIT Press's table in the back to learn more about the Rochester History Journal and the Press's other offerings. And Mark Ferrara will also be selling and signing copies of his book at the back of the room as well following the presentation. Before I turn today's program over to Rich Newman to introduce our guests, I just want to mention a few housekeeping items. Men's and women's bathrooms are located just outside the program, so if you were to go out the back door, just make 2 quick lefts, and the restrooms are essentially right over here. There are also gender-neutral restrooms located on the link level just below us downstairs. If you are attending the Rochester History Reception after Mark's talk, it will be on the 2nd floor, and staff will be available to direct you at the rear of the room following the presentation. And so now I would like to introduce Rich Newman, Professor of History at RIT. Rich?
Thanks, Christine. Welcome, everyone here. We're really excited about this event. We've been working on it for several months, and we think this is the perfect moment to welcome Mark Ferrara to Rochester to talk about his amazing book, The Ragiing Erie. I see a lot of familiar faces here. I won't take too long with my introduction, but I do want to thank a number of people who have helped make this event possible, and I think in the spirit of community building, you will see that is indispensable. So first of all, I want to give a big thank you and shout out to Christine Ragiing and everyone here at the Rochester Public Library. Wonderful partners in programming and everything relating to Rochester history. I want to thank Emily Morey for helping out with all the logistics. She's got a great walking tour relating to things that Mark will talk about on the Erie Canal, so hopefully you will check that out. I want to thank everyone in the RIT History Department, including our amazing chair, Tamara Carroll, for helping to make this event possible. Our dean in the College of Liberal Arts, Kelly Martin, has generously provided funding for this event. Peggy Knoll, our staff assistant, who hopefully is watching on YouTube, has been amazing in terms of things like ordering books, helping facilitate travel. Rebecca Edwards, who will be offering a toast later on, and is a well-known author in all sorts of themes relating to Rochester history, has also been a supporter of events like this. The RIT Press, Rochester History, I could go on and on, but the point is here, it truly does take a village to put on an event like this. In terms of books, I will just say that The Ragiing Erie is available in a wonderful paperback edition, and you can get it at a wonderful price on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, at your favorite independent bookstore like Book Culture, on Pittsford. We have 20 copies. They are not for sale because we bought them, and so we cannot sell them, but we are going to give them away to people in the audience and folks who will be coming to the reception later on. So after the event, I will see if there are educators here, students, and then just people who are interested in Rochester history. So you're going to see the books back there, but they will be given away, and hopefully, if you have a copy, you can have Mark Ferrara sign it. So I just wanted to make sure that I was clear about that. Okay, now to our distinguished guest. Mark Ferrara is a professor of English at SUNY Oneonta. He's published a number of books and is working on several more very interesting topics and projects relating to travel, nonfiction. He's a brilliant writer. This book on the Erie Canal, I think, is one that we've been waiting for a long time. There's a lot of great books that celebrate the Erie Canal as a great effort in infrastructure, finance, town building. No one has provided this 360 portrait that fills in the lives of the laborers and the working poor who help make this incredible thing possible. So will you please help me welcome Mark Ferrara to talk about the Ragiing Erie.
Hello everybody, how you doing today? It's wonderful to see you on a dreary April afternoon. I was reminded today, this morning, of T.S. Eliot's famous poem. He says, "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain." And to me, today feels like one of those kind of dreary April days. So thank you for coming out today. It's wonderful to see you. And there's been a lot of acknowledgments already, but I do feel like I should recognize the Office of Rochester and Monroe County Historical Society, the RIT Department of History, the RIT Press for helping make this event possible, and Christine Radarski, City Historian and Director of Historical Services for the Rochester Public Library, Tamar Carroll, RIT History Department Chair, and of course, Richard Newman, Dr. Richard Newman, RIT History Professor, who did the introduction, and he is the author of a wonderful book called Love Canal, A Toxic History from Colonial Times to the Present, with Oxford University Press, and that book was also made into a documentary on PBS, so you can find that on your PBS station as well. So thank you so much for the invite. I thought today I'd try to get through a couple different sections of the book. So I wanted to read a little bit about a little bit that sets up the approach that I took with the Ragiing Erie, which Dr. Newman already mentioned is kind of a focus on the poor and working classes along the canal, who seem to sometimes disappear out of our celebrations of the great achievement that the canal represents, a political achievement, environmental, engineering achievement, and so on. And yesterday we were on the WXXI Connections program. Maybe some of you heard that. And there was a question or a comment that came in about trying to remind us about the Haudenosaunee and the fact that the lands that the canal is built through were once Native American territories. And so I thought I'd do just a little bit from the first chapter, which kind of details that history. And then to end, I wanted to come back to something a little lighter and something local. So the third reading or section of reading will be focused on Rochester, actually. So does that sound okay to you? And I thought if I could introduce the book and maybe do a little bit of the Haudenosaunee section, there's not much of it, then we can kind of open up for questions and discussion, and then I can come back up and do the Rochester section, and then we can open it up again for discussion, comments. So does that sound okay to you? Okay, so again, thank you so much for being here. It's really a pleasure to be with you. So as a way to set up the Ragiing Erie, it seems fitting on the cusp of the bicentennial of the completion of the Erie Canal to weigh the impact of that artificial river on American society from the perspective of the 21st century, when the canal is a national heritage corridor, its waters filled with pleasure boats, kayaks, canoes, and commercial craft. Gone forever are the hoagies, the saloons, the glamorous packets, the tow animals, and the blacksmith shops, and with them the sights, sounds, and smells of real life for millions of ordinary people lost to history, who labored on the docks and in the mills, served on boat crews and repaired vessels, worked in its stores and shops, lodged in its boarding houses, and patronized its restaurants, farmed on its banks, and toiled in its factories. The nation was young in 1825, and for many New Yorkers, the canal became a symbol of progress, a model for internal improvement, a testament to the advances in transportation and technology, an exemplar of self-governance and civic participation. It linked the eastern seaboard with westward expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains, represented a triumph over nature, and demonstrated Yankee ingenuity, and confirmed the blessings of liberty and the inevitable march of progress that would make New York the leading state during the 19th century and help propel the nation to superpower status by the middle of the 20th. The second largest artificial waterway in the world at the time of its completion, only the 1,100-mile ancient Grand Canal in China that linked the northern capital of Beijing with the former southern capital of Hangzhou, was longer. The Erie Canal was so phenomenally successful that New York State expanded it 3 times. First from 1836 to 1862, second from 1884 to 1890, and third from 1896 to 1918. And it constructed a series of lateral canals that provided access to Erie ports from other parts of the state. At the height of the canal system, at its height, the canal system connected Lakes Erie, Ontario, Seneca, Cayuga, Oneida, and Champlain, and the Hudson, Susquehanna, Allegheny, and Delaware rivers, so that nearly every place of any size in New York State was connected to every other by water route. And this was part of a larger canal era that some of you may be familiar with. Consequently, chroniclers of the Erie Canal have tended to glorify the design, the construction, the impact of that waterway using language normally reserved for legendary civic leaders and accomplishments of highest distinction. The writing of these and other scholars, which inform this work, fill important gaps in our understanding of the origin, construction, impact, and enduring legacy of the Erie Canal. Theirs is a weighty history. Oh, I'm hearing the mic come in and out. How are we doing? We're okay? Okay. Theirs is a weighty history that celebrates that waterway because it helped profoundly refigure American society. Yet the canal proved a contradictory creation. It brought more democracy via the facility of movement, interconnection of social relations, and new understandings of social reform, but it simultaneously introduced more inequality into 19th century life by way of unequal wealth, social dislocation, the callous treatment of essential workers in and around the canal zone. What often gets lost in celebrations of the politicians, engineers, and business leaders who championed the canal and grew rich from it are members of the poor and working classes who made their lives for better or worse, frequently worse, along its banks. Many of these people on the razor's edge of progress suffered silently and invisibly its deepest lacerations. The toil and triumph against nature and overwhelming odds that characterize achievements such as the Erie Canal and the Transcontinental Railroad are central to America's historical imagination, and the nation has tended to praise perceived architects of these technological marvels as, quote, visionaries whose work brought the nation bountiful riches and did the Lord's bidding, unquote. Most indexes of American history have reinforced this narrative of progress for generations. But if this nationalistic idealism is the historical memory, historian Ryan Derringer asserts, it's conveniently stunted. What, he asks, quote, of those bodies strained and broke under the load of such glories? What of those people beyond the din and fanfare who appear only in old photographs with faces blurred and indistinguishable? In their lives and deaths in the mud, muck mountains is another history of American achievement. These barely visible, oft-forgotten, ordinary folk were the true source of economic growth and progress. The laboring poor and the working class, men, women, children, blacks, whites, unskilled, semi-skilled, immigrant, and native-born, found themselves trapped in an unbridled form of early capitalism wherein employers exploited these people as cheap labor to plow fields, construct canals and railroads, dig mines, and to operate machinery in the country's emerging mills and factories. Right here in Rochester, right? Transient canal laborers have tried to frame their struggles as self-sacrifice and developed a rough culture of survival, but community members interpreted their reckless behavior in shanty towns and construction camps as evidence of their poor fit for American society. That narrative categorized destitute, transient, foreign-born laborers as necessary, but also as drunken, violent, unproductive, and uncivilized. Rhetorically, it laid claim to national progress while distancing foreign-born and poor and working classes from the fruits of their labor. The rise of canals to national prominence as a means of transportation depended on the menial labor of tens of thousands of people who strung together livelihoods at the economic fringes of society, who left no paper trail, who endured and were shaped by the soft underbelly of American progress. Across New York and the nation, in taverns and bedrooms, along avenues and on street corners, disenfranchised people socialized, sang, loved, gossiped, primped, promenaded, and fought. Yet, if capitalist transformation gave rise to new class solidarities, it also fed countervailing forces of patriarchy, nativism, sectarianism, and white supremacy that pulled workers apart as people directed prejudice against one another. White workers used minstrelsy to degrade African Americans. Native-born workers paraded with stuffed patties to antagonize Irish immigrants. And laboring men caroused in a misogynistic sporting culture. Indeed, many forms of civic inequality and national identity emerged out of a deep-seated belief that America was a white Protestant country and that true American citizens were native-born men with Anglo-Saxon ancestors. The Ragiing Erie attempts to reckon with the violence, pain that permeated the lives of the poor and working classes on and near the Erie Canal. And in doing so, it interprets the corridor from Albany to Buffalo as a realm of trauma as well as triumph, a site of alienation and powerlessness as well as achievement and national progress, a place of proletarianization and exploitation as well as of a gradual assimilation and the formation of a collective national identity. The lives of the poor and working classes are often left unsung in accounts of antebellum America, but then again, the very laborers who toiled against great odds to build the canal were left unrepresented in lavish ceremonies celebrating its completion, including in the grand procession known as the Wedding of the Waters, which will be recreated, right? You probably already heard about that. The Seneca Chief boat has been reconstructed and it's going to float from Albany to Buffalo, and they're going to reenact the Wedding of the Waters. And so let's see what kind of symbolism and inclusion they have 200 years later. It'll be interesting to see. This book honors those upon whose backs American progress was built with grueling labor, paid in wages of impoverishment in dangerous and often violent places. I've attempted to give voice to the voiceless lost to time through historical recreations of life on the canal grounded in scholarship, archival research, and stories of witnesses who testified to the profound transformations wrought on American society by the loss of artisan production and family farming and the rise of industrialization, market capitalism, and unprecedented levels of immigration. So that's just a short section that kind of introduces the focus of the book, and hopefully you can see how this approach differs from some of the other excellent books that are available on the canal. If it's okay, I'd like to do just a little bit more reading, just a bit, but I want to go to the question of the Haudenosaunee and the question that came up yesterday on the radio show, where a caller was pointing out, hey, we need to remember this was all Haudenosaunee territory at one point, and there were lots of unequal treaties that disenfranchised Native Americans. Of course, there's the introduction of diseases when colonizers came in that made taking over those lands much easier because of the decimation of native populations that occurred naturally through viruses, let alone warfare and deliberate disenfranchisement. So chapter 1 tells that story fairly completely, but I want to pick up just at the very end of that chapter for a couple paragraphs as a kind of way to quickly suggest the scope of that disenfranchisement. In May 1819, an editor at the Cherry Valley Gazette marveled at the vast difference in the landscape compared to the late 1750s. And he invoked a doctrine of westward expansion beyond the Rocky Mountains that became known as Manifest Destiny. At Independence Day celebrations in Syracuse a year later, DeWitt Clinton, the Attorney General, the Speaker of the Assembly, and other notables aboard the Oneida Chief joined in a procession of 73 boats moving west to east on the Erie Canal. The thousands in attendance at Syracuse included 100 to 200 Haudenosaunee, possibly from the nearby Oneida and Onondaga reservations, who appeared astonished at the booming guns, festive music, and decorations which were calculated, it seemed, to, quote, induce them to think that a kind of supernatural spirit was changing the face of that country, which was lately a wilderness, unquote. Envisioning little potential for indigenous people in this landscape of farmers and canals, white observers laid the intellectual groundwork for future calls that Native Americans leave Iroquois and more broadly relocate west of the Mississippi. During the 1830s, the Haudenosaunee faced speculators and their political allies who continued to press for additional land concessions, which they cast as part of a necessary and benevolent national project of, quote, Indian removal, unquote. One of the most devastating policies the U.S. government ever adopted in its treatment of Native Americans. The passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which appropriated money to remove indigenous nations from east of the Mississippi River to its westward side, posed a threat to most Native American tribes. For the Haudenosaunee, the crisis caused by removal lasted well into the 1850s. Their bargaining power waning, and I should just back up just a little bit and say the Haudenosaunee were very adept at playing colonial interest for a couple hundred years. But eventually they were kind of overwhelmed by the influx of European immigrants. Their bargaining power waning, the Six Nations wrote a series of letters to various federal government officials and entities, the President, Congress, and the Senate. Despite many negative experiences with U.S. law, such as the Buffalo Creek Treaty of 1838, the Haudenosaunee turned to American courts to call attention to illegal acts committed in the making of these treaties, and they frequently used proper legal terminology to describe what took place, with fraud and bribery high on the list of complaints. The Seneca's largest reservation at Buffalo Creek stood inconveniently astride the Erie Canal's route, and its inhabitants were displaced in what an Iroquois scholar calls, quote, one of the major frauds in American Indian history, unquote. Bribery, forgery, alcohol, and other nefarious means were deployed to effect the ceding of all remaining Seneca lands in New York State, save for the 1 mile square Oil Springs Reservation to the Ogden Land Company. The Seneca had to occupy a Kansas reservation within 5 years or forfeit even that narrow tract. In response to more Native American and white protests about the 1838 Accord, a so-called compromise treaty was concluded at Buffalo Creek in 1842 to address the Haudenosaunee's continuing criticism of the U.S. government's treatment of their people. It restored 2 of the reservations that had been lost, but it failed to return the other 2. Instead of forcing all Iroquois to remove, the populations of the last 2 reservations were to be distributed to Allegheny and Qatar-Argus, excuse me for that, which worsened the situation for some of the Haudenosaunee, particularly those who stood to lose their reservations. Soon, the Iroquois faced another challenge: repeated state policies of forced assimilation and so-called Americanization process composed of a 4-prong formula. The Christianizing activities of missionaries on reservations, exposure to white culture through New York State supported schools established from the mid-1840s onward, the division of tribal lands among individual Native Americans, and the rewarding of U.S. citizenship. A generation earlier, the Seneca chief Red Jacket had realized that any such efforts, quote, instead of producing that happy effect which you so long promised us, its introduction so far has rendered us uncomfortable and miserable. You have a number of our young men to your schools. You have educated them and taught them your religion. They have returned to their kindred and color, neither white men nor Indians. The arts they have learned are incompatible with the chase and ill-adapted to our customs. They have been taught that which is useless to us. They have been made to feel artificial wants, which never entered the minds of their brothers. They have imbibed in your great towns the seeds of vices which were unknown in the forest. They have become discouraged and dissipated, despised by the Indians, neglected by the whites, and without value to either, less honest than the former, and perhaps more knavish than the latter. Unquote. Most Iroquois rejected this Americanization program, and though considerably more than 300 Iroquois Indians joined the Union side during the American Civil War, within 30 years of the Treaty of Buffalo Creek, more than 100,000 non-Indigenous people had settled within the city's boundaries. By the mid to late 1860s, the Iroquois had all but vanished into the romanticized world of James Fenimore Cooper's Leather Stocking Tales. A recent study in the journal Science concludes that tribal nations have lost an astonishing 98.9% of cumulative coextensive lands and suffered a 93.9% reduction in non-coextensive lands. Of tribes that still have a land base, their present-day land holdings are an average of 2.6% the size of their estimated historical ones, and are in areas more exposed to the effects of climate change. That dreadful reality finds poignant expression in a burial mound that still stands on the corner of Route 33 in Cooperstown, which contains Native American remains excavated nearby and reburied in 1874. The mound is marked with a stone plaque set into its side that reads, "White man, greeting. We near whose bones you stand were Iroquois. The wide land which is now yours was ours. Friendly hands have given back to us enough for a tomb." Not the most cheerful material. I promise the second reading will be more uplifting. But I wanted to give you a kind of sense of a different point of view on this great accomplishment that is the Erie Canal that transformed your city from a frontier outpost into one of the first boom towns in America. And at one point, I think the 9th largest city in the United States. But I'm happy to open up at this point before we go back in one more time for a reading focused on Rochester of just kind of thoughts, comments, questions that any of that reading might have evoked. Sure. We'll use the microphone here because I think we've got a recording going on.
Can you comment on your choice of title? I mean, that implies a certain amount of violence that I didn't hear in your discussion.
Yeah, I took that as one of the nicknames for the canal. So most people probably know Clinton's Ditch as kind of a derogatory name. And so the Raging Erie was kind of a phrase that was floating around at the time to try to capture all of the activity, good and bad, along the canal. Yeah, right. It's not the water. That makes sense, right. Yeah, so I saw that in my research, and then I was looking at the titles of other books on the canal, and I realized nobody had used it. And so I was like, that seems, it just seemed perfect. So, and a lot of my research was like that. It just kind of emerged naturally. That's a really good question. Thank you. Other questions, thoughts, comments, anything at all? Yes.
Opened up about the immigrants and the workers that dug that ditch by hand.
Yes.
Okay, and a pick, maybe a shovel. So many died. Did they just dump them in the ditch? I mean, have the archaeologists found any of these people all along? I mean, it's a pretty long way.
That's a really good question. The Montezuma swamps was one of the worst parts to dig through. And there are scholarly accounts that suggest up to 1,000 people, workers, died of waterborne illness and other kinds of diseases doing that. But there's also been a kind of look back at that, and no mass graves have been found. And so there's kind of a reevaluation of that assertion going on. No, you're right. You're right. And I gave a presentation on campus a couple weeks ago, partially related to this. And one of my colleagues in anthropology was like, I would love to dig up one of those skeletons and do a kind of analysis of maybe their nutrition, the injuries that they... Yeah. But you're right. This is not that I know of. Are there cemeteries where we could go and know that the people buried there once worked on building the Erie Canal.
Anywhere along the canal that dedicates to the people who dug it, or not at all?
I would think so. Certainly I must have seen that along the canal, yeah. And I think we're in the process of a kind of revision of this history. So I also gave a presentation last year at the Erie Canal Museum, and one of the curators came up to me afterwards and said that they were redesigning their whole exhibition to include voices of the poor and working classes who dug the canal. So I think that we're kind of seeing a acknowledgement of other people who contributed to the construction of the canal, which seems positive and right somehow. So I think we're in the process of including these voices, which is very good and very gratifying. Yes?
There are a couple of young men that were taken out of the Indian Society and whitified, taught to read and write, and the purpose, I believe, would be to, right, and so when they went back to their own people, they weren't accepted in the Native American group or the white group. At this time, I think everybody's probably heard of the Canadian schools, where the Native Canadian children were taken away to erase their culture. Did that happen at this time too, as mile after mile of the canal was being built? Did they take their children away?
Yes. Pennsylvania had one of those most notorious schools. Yes. You want to? Sure.
I have a question. The Panama Canal also saw a lot of mortality, and I wonder whether there was more death from the injuries and just the workload for the Erie Canal compared to, say, the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal had a lot of things like yellow fever, cholera, and so forth, but we still had those diseases in the U.S. And I wonder if there was an equivalent mortality rate.
I wish I could answer that definitively for you. I haven't done much work on the Panama Canal, but it's a really fabulous question. And mortality figures are hard to come by for the Erie Canal. Keep in mind that if somebody's injured on the canal, there's no protections, there's no workers' insurance, there's no safety protocols. If somebody broke their leg and couldn't work again, there was no pension. And so these people kind of disappeared once they were injured. So those kinds of records are hard to come by. The first couple years of canal construction, 1817 to 1819, there was a little more record keeping about what workers were working where, but these were mostly local hires along the early part of the canal around Rome, which was flat, and you could do like 60 miles without having to really build locks. And so that was mostly local farm labor, local contracts, and then you'd have a surveyor, or not engineer, because we really didn't have engineers at this time, as you know. And they would come and pay somebody once the work was done. And so we have some records of those early workers, but then the hardest part of the construction of the canal were the east and west portions. And by that time you have a large influx of Irish immigrants, and then our records are
Treated better.
they certainly wouldn't have suffered the prejudice and racism that Irish Catholics particularly. But it's hard to imagine, and I hope my book gets at it a little bit. I was surprised myself as I was researching the kind of negative attitudes mainstream American society had of Irish and Irish immigrants. And a lot of them arrived in decrepit condition after, certainly once the famine gets started. And so they're weakened after this long voyage. They land on the shore. They've got to deal with docks and, figuring out where to get work. And so there's descriptions of some Irish workers emaciated, 100-pound, 90-pound workers that kind of barely survived the trauma of their own country, the voyage, and then coming here. And they often did live in shanty towns, and they were associated with kind of the vices of the poor and working classes. And so there was a lot of marginalization for them. So I think in that sense, they fared the first builders fared a little better. But I just finished a draft of a paper on black life along the canal, which I have a chapter. But I felt after one of these events, I got a question about how many black workers were digging the canal early on, and I couldn't really answer the question. So I thought, I need to learn more about this. So I kind of went back in, and I'm in the process of finishing that paper. And slavery doesn't end in New York until 1827. So there were black enslaved and free blacks working along the canal. But again, it's very hard to get a clear picture of how many where, but they were often segregated too. So that couldn't have been an easy experience for early local canal diggers.
Does it still exist? Is it increasing?
It's slipping my mind. It's right near Carlisle. Thank you. I was going to say right near Scranton. Yeah, right. You guys know it. Right, exactly. And there's some documentaries that are revisiting that history too. Yeah. Thank you. Yep.
Just a follow-up to what you were talking about, I was particularly interested. You were talking about how local people in the Utica area were working for the canal in the first stage, and then the Irish at the two kind of ends. But I was also wondering, with the expansion over the different periods, were there other groups that were coming in, Italians? I was just curious if there was certain, groups that were more at different expansions. Thank you.
That's a very good question too. And my book focuses on 1825, the completion of the canal, to the Civil War. And I really wanted to focus on that because the canal diminishes in terms of passenger travel along the canal, and the rise of the railroads suddenly shifts. And of course, the canal had to close during the winter too. So my research doesn't really deal with the subsequent expansions of the canal. I would suspect some Italian immigrants participating in that, but I hesitate to say too much more about it. I'm just curious if Rich might know more about that. Is there any of the other historians here? Yeah, I'm not really sure. So that may be one of those questions where I go home and say, look around and learn some more. And that's one of the great things about doing events like this is, in fact, I'm constantly learning more about the canal from questions like this. And so you always regret not being able to give a good answer to a question, but on the other hand, it's an opportunity to learn more. Giuseppe?
Yeah, my name, I'm Italian. Okay. And I was born in northern Italy, close between, very, very close, 20 miles from the town of Romeo and Juliet, Verona. One thing about Italians, the majority of Italians that came to America were from southern Italy because of the poverty, because north of Milan and things like that, there was much more opportunity for jobs and things like that. And one thing that always comes to mind also, I like Erie Canal from Ireland, as the name of Ireland. And the three largest group of incoming were German, Irish, and Italian, because there was poverty. If the British didn't give the potato famine, there would be St. Patrick's Day here right now. Okay, think about that. That's how it happened. So the history is so intertwined, how all this generation came in and the way the country grew and blossomed in a very special way.
Excellent. Appreciate that. Thank you for filling that out. Wonderful. And I should say my own family came from southern Italy. Yeah. No, I don't. Maybe one letter off. That's right. That's right. 4 faculty members. Any other quick thoughts? I did want to do a little bit more reading.
Was there any kind of organized effort to bring immigrants over with the promise of, how wonderful life will be, and yet they find themselves working in really terrible conditions?
Really good question. I have a chapter on immigrants, and I quote some letters that people wrote back, and they weren't always cheery. We were promised this, and this, but you might want to just stay home. If you do come here, watch when you're on the docks. People are going to sell you fake tickets, right? You got to bring your own food and water sometimes on these trips. And so they come with a lot of warnings. So yes, there was active recruitment for workers, and they often found themselves kind of disillusioned by what they found compared to what they were promised. Yeah. And my chapter on immigration does kind of walk through that. Yeah. So maybe something a little more cheery, and then we'll open it up again. And I thought this would be appropriate because it's focused in the Rochester area, so some of you may be able to add to this treatment. So I'm going to try to switch over here. My fault. Speaker error. Sorry for that. My apologies. So this is the beginning of Chapter 6, Ghosts, Hellfire, excuse me, and Revival on the Psychic Highway. On November 14th, 1849, nearly 400 people packed Corinthian Hall, the most prestigious site for concerts and lectures in the canal boom town of Rochester. They had paid 25 cents each to see and hear for themselves the Hydesville rappings demonstrated by the sisters Kate and Margaret Fox. Doors opened at 7 in the evening, and audience members took their seats good-humoredly in anticipation of an entertaining expose of spiritualism. Maggie walked on stage wearing a soft blue dress, which made her an appealing, unimposing figure. With Kate visiting friends in Auburn, their older sister Leah joined Maggie and submitted to the examination that followed their performance. In his introductory remarks, Mr. Capron propounded on the rise and progress of these strange manifestations as rappings attributed to the spirits of the dead were heard throughout the room. A reporter from the Auburn Daily Advertiser expressed reluctant admiration for Maggie, Leah, and the ghosts, whose knocking commenced as soon as the young women entered the hall and, quote, continued to the great astonishment of those who had gone thither with gaping ears to catch the mysterious sounds. Confronted with noises attributed to disembodied spirits, audience members could imagine a spirit they hoped to contact, expressed bewilderment at the insistent knocking of the ghosts, or project themselves into the role of skeptic and investigator. Following the first night's demonstration, a committee of 5 men were nominated and charged with investigating the origins of the supernatural visitations. The next day, they kept the location for their first examination, Rochester's Sons of Temperance Hall, 2 Erie, New York, 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 2 a secret until the last minute to prevent any trickery by Maggie and Leah. To the frustration of committee members, nothing could be found suggesting deception, even after separating the girls into different rooms and holding the sisters' feet above the floor. That night, the sisters repeated their performance at Corinthian Hall, and a second committee was formed consisting of known skeptics of spiritualism. But even they came away flummoxed. By the sisters' fourth performance, admission had dropped to just 12 cents a head. The knocks continued to envelop the sisters, even though they stood on feather pillows with their long skirts tied around their ankles. Three women performed a search of Maggie and Leah's gowns, petticoats, and underwear for noise-making devices such as lead and balls. A third committee formed, but the audience for a final show after 4 consecutive days at Corinthian Hall hurled openly hostile remarks and ribald jokes at Maggie, a beautiful dark-haired young woman wrapped in a heavy black shawl. Suddenly, firecrackers exploded at the back of the auditorium and filled it with smoke. As the crowd surged towards the stage to interrogate the Fox sisters for themselves, Rochester's police justice and his men hastily escorted Maggie, Leah, and their friends out of the auditorium. Few in the audience for the Fox sisters' performance would have known that the rappings they witnessed would launch a mid to late 19th century obsession with spirit seances, ghosts, and other supernatural phenomena. Part of a broader cultural shift away from traditional religions in the wake of revolutions in science, industry, and transportation, the ruckus created by the Fox sisters during those 4 November nights had begun 2 years earlier as a practical joke. Yet the spiritualist craze they set off in their childhood home continued to capture the public imagination for decades, and it endures in so-called New Age spirituality to this day. The movement the sisters founded began in a humble 1-story structure on their farm in Hydesville, just 2 miles northeast of present-day Newark, a canal town near Palmyra where another seer would found the Mormon religion. A coat of pea green paint lent the 75-year-old structure intended as a house, intended to house a mechanic or farm laborer, a smart appearance that hid a shabby, tumble-down interior. John D. Fox moved into the dwelling in December 1847 with his wife and pre-teenage and teenage daughters Maggie and Kate. 4 months later, after the Fox family went to bed, a knocking sound in the girls' bedroom seemed to come from the floor. A search of the house failed to reveal a source for the sounds and the reverberant shaking of the old house they caused. The sounds, soon attributed to entities in the spirit world, continued so long as anyone was awake. As the strange sounds persisted, neighbors were called in, and rumors of a murder on the property spread like wildfire. Residents of Newark, Palmyra, and Lyons descended on the hovel and listened in wonder to the raps, which, in coded thumping, revealed the source of the noises to be the spirit of a dead peddler named Charles R. Rosma, purportedly a father of 5 children who was murdered by a former resident of the house and buried in the cellar. The prank the youngest daughters perpetrated on their parents may have begun out of restlessness after a long winter or out of simple mischievousness, bouncing apples from the cellar on the floor next to their bed, but soon the girls took their trick farther. The sisters learned to create rapping sounds with the joints of their toes and claimed to be able to communicate with Rosma's spirit by asking questions like the ages of people in the room, which were followed by a series of knocks corresponding to their ages. Neighbors such as Mary Redfield were called to the home of the credulous parents. Her initial levity at being summoned because the house was haunted dissipated quickly when she found Mrs. Fox, and apparently the girls, very much frightened. When Mary asked the spirit questions, it promptly responded, and more neighbors were called to bear witness to the noises and interrogate the ghost. William Dusler took charge of the questioning and focused on learning the circumstances of the spirit's murder. Simple questions were answered by raps for yes and silence for no. 3 or 4 knocks meant undecided. And 5 in quick succession meant recourse must be made to the alphabet to spell out answers. In this manner, Dusler determined that the peddler had had his throat cut with a butcher's knife by the previous tenant for the $500 he carried. And his body was buried 10 feet below the ground in the cellar. Digging over several days stopped only when water was hit. As more people came to satisfy their curiosity, 300 to 500, by some accounts, newspapers picked up the story and printed signed documents from principal witnesses. When Leah, Maggie, and Kate's older sister, Leah Fish, Kate's older sister, learned about the rapping, she boarded the Erie Canal packet boat to Newark. She found the family sheltering from the spirit rappings in Hydesville at her brother David's house, but the thumpings continued at night whenever the younger sisters were present. Taking them aside, Leah learned the truth. But instead of exposing her siblings, she learned to make the rapping sounds herself, probably sensing an economic opportunity. About 2 weeks later, Leah and Kate boarded another packet and returned to Rochester. Maggie, who seemed to have had reservations about her older sister's new role, chose to stay home with her mother. Leah embellished the cliched ghost story of the murdered peddler, and soon she circulated reports in Rochester of a family tormented by spirits that produced terrorizing sounds, moved beds as family members tried to sleep, and hurled objects through the air. Soon they were holding crowded seances in towns and cities across the nation, charging as much as $1 a person, and might have accumulated small fortunes had they not been superseded by more inventive performers such as Cora Hatch, the Davenport brothers, the Eddy brothers, Leroy Sunderland, Madame Debar, and countless other mediums and clairvoyants. A couple more paragraphs, is that okay? You doing okay? We'll just do 2 or 3 more paragraphs. The Fox sisters were a product of a cauldron of social reform movements, emergent religions, and alternative communities in the burned-over district. The collective religious enthusiasm known as the Second Great Awakening hit its apex along the Erie Canal corridor shortly after that waterway completion in 1825. Even during its construction phases, the canal brought enormous development and prosperity to formerly marginal frontier presbyteries. The canal elevated much of upstate New York to a level of national influence, and it was critically important to the diffusion of innovation and ideas that would have a profound intellectual influence on the nation. Communities once isolated in the western frontier began coming to life as factories and mills brought the Industrial Revolution to the New York countryside. And dramatic infrastructure changes facilitated rapid increases in interstate and intercontinental commerce, manufacturing, and transportation. Young people began moving from New England to central and upstate New York in search of cheaper land and more opportunity, and many of these settlers were drawn to canal towns like Rochester, one of the nation's first boom towns. They sought alternatives to the traditional religions of New England, and they found them in a variety of sects and communities that soon filled the burned-over district. A new generation of historians has extended that district of revivals and reforms from Vermont and western Massachusetts through central and western New York and into Ohio's Western Reserve and Michigan. In sermons that shaped evangelical Protestantism of the Second Great Awakening, preachers and circuit riders delivered a message that spurred their listeners to change by linking their actions in this life with their fate in the afterlife, a conception based on a doctrine of free will that stood in contrast to the Calvinistic belief in predestination and conversion. Once converted, these individuals were expected to abide by Christ's law and to encourage others to do the same, so as to bring about the second coming, a vision of Christian perfection made possible by the checking of one's baser instincts through a process of constant self-discipline. Temperance, moral improvement, reform of schools, prisons, and asylums targeted the perceived depravity of a growing number of poor and working class men, women, and children who did not benefit from industrialization and were increasingly associated with sinful lifestyles. The realities of urban poverty shocked visitors who offered disturbing accounts of rampant crime, prostitution, drunkenness, gambling, and violence among the underprivileged and an increasing number of immigrants. And that's part of the story of the Erie Canal too, is that a lot of the vice that was found in bigger cities like New York City was replicated in small towns along the canal corridor as people were constantly moving back and forth. And so small towns in upstate New York had to learn to deal with transient populations, the poor and working class, marginalized people living on the fringes in shanty towns. But out of that suffering came that variety of social reform movements that eventually transformed America for the better. So there is a positive side to this story of the poor and working classes. And we still see the influence of those reform movements in movements like the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, prison reform, and so on in our own day. Okay, so I'm happy to open it up again for any thoughts or questions as we finish up here. We're just about 5 minutes over the hour. Yes, we're going to switch over here. I should say. Okay.
I just want to first thank Mr. Ferrara for this really interesting history for including a lot of the history that we sure didn't learn in school. Kind of a silly question, but when I was in school, public school here in the 60s, we used to sing songs about the Erie Canal. And I know you talked about the lack of a paper trail for these folks who we think some of my husband's Irish ancestors might have worked. Are there any histories like through oral tradition or folk that tell about these people? And are there any databases online where we could look to see if somebody worked on the Erie Canal? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are good questions. And that was the challenge of putting this book together, was finding the sources. So I do wish there was such a database or an organized collection of oral history to do this kind of thing. As I've been giving talks along the canal corridor, I have run into people who have family letters, for example, and have relatives, Irish relatives who have moved along the canal corridor, some of them settling in the Midwest. And some of those records are incomplete, but I'm always really interested to hear that, because those personal family letters are not necessarily accessible to the historian who's using Cornell Library databases or SUNY databases or the New York State Library or even genealogical records or census records. So that's the tricky part about doing a book like this, is that we have to rely on some kind of untraditional sources sometimes, often what other people said about the poor and working classes. So people who were traveling along the canal corridor, because the canal, Niagara Falls, not too far from here, was always a big kind of tourist attraction. even in antebellum America. So there were Europeans who wanted to see this magical landscape that was quickly disappearing, by the way, of old-growth forests and natural beauty. So they left some records behind of people laboring on the Erie Canal. Protestant reformers trying to address what they saw as vice and suffering along the canal would leave records behind about the orphan Hoagies who suffered working 6 hours on, 6 hours off, 6 hours on, 6 hours off, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week along the canal while it was open, and then discussing what happened to them, how they had to make ends meet when the canal closed, and often those young people found themselves stuck somewhere along the canal corridor, often without resources. And there are many stories of unscrupulous captains not paying those children at the end of the season the wages that they were due. So we kind of have to reconstruct that portrait and perspective through a variety of sources. Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You alluded at the beginning of your talk about the 200th anniversary celebrations, the Wedding of the Waters, and you're more in touch with that. And I haven't heard anything about this. Can you tell us more about what to expect as a canal boomtown and along the corridor of the canal?
That's good. I don't know that I'm the best person to do that. I think there's people here that are probably a little better suited to that. Christine, great. Awesome.
Hi.
Thank you.
So if I understand it, your question is about like what's coming up in the year ahead? Perfect. Great question. So there will be events all throughout the year. So next week, Cornhill Navigation is actually launching their celebration. They're the ones who have the Sam Patch boats and the Riverie over in Cornhill Landing. So they have a series of events planned, special speakers on their boats this year. The government-appointed historians throughout the county are planning a series of walking tours in all of our canal towns along the waterway. You've got, your annual events like Fairport's Canal Days that will be extra special this year. Pittsford is also planning numerous events. The big celebration will really not come until September. And in September, I think Mark mentioned they've built a replica of the Seneca Chief, which is the boat that was involved in this Wedding of the Waters when the full canal opened in 1825. It left Buffalo with a bucket full of water, traveled all across the state down into New York City, and then wetted the waters by dumping that Lake Erie water into the Atlantic. As Patrick Walsh-Russell said yesterday, they don't really want to do that in these days when we're concerned about environmental effects of water being transported from one place to another. So they're going to be planting white pines all along the route, and then that final pine they plant in New York City will be watered with the water that they're going to collect water all along the way from the different spots and water that. But there's actually a World Canals Conference in Buffalo in September. It is an international affair. We will have people in Buffalo from all over the world. And then the day that conference concludes, they will send the Seneca Chief off. It will make stops here in Rochester, Fairport, and Pittsford. And there will be celebrations, the opportunities to get on the boat. There will be historic displays, reenactments, all sorts of fun things. So if you're interested in these events, your go-to place here in Rochester and Monroe County is Visit Rochester. They actually have an events calendar, and they will be including all of the Erie Canal Bicentennial events. So, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Excellent.
This is not a question as much as AARP, which I think we're all familiar with, has just come out in February with the 8 affordable U.S. destinations in 2025. Number 1, Fairport, New York.
All right.
The bicentennial of the Erie Canal.
All right.
And it's telling the travelers when to travel, what to do. So I thought that was pretty exciting. AARP is...
Yes. Indeed.
So there it is.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I want to share something.
Thank you.
A very funny story that friends of mine that graduated from Union College was teaching with me at Cornell many years ago, and how the names of America came about. So Union College, all of a sudden, America was expanded, and they needed to give names. So they went to the college there, and the faculty member of history or geography, faculty member are pretty lazy to teach one class. They are medium rare, okay? They say, okay, let's call name. Ithaca from Greece, am I right? Manchester, Rochester from England, and all over. And other names unique is that they were very funny during COVID. Town of Ovid, a Roman, as you go down to Ithaca, there is Ovid, and you know what they did to some young kids? They put the name C, COVID, so no one would stop. They lost all the business. But the name came about, on the west coast of Mexico, and Native American people. That's how the name came about.
At the Statler School of Hotel Management.
Hi, could you
Hi.
talk a little bit about the cobblestones and the connection between the Erie Canal, or is there cobblestone houses?
I'm not sure I can do that. Okay, good. Excellent. Okay. I'm sorry, Okay. Okay. Interesting. The German immigrants are most associated with stone work along the canal, and that was skilled labor. So you do have a lot of tiers of labor along the canal, and so the scut work is, of course, the lowest kind of level. At least in my research, the German immigrants are most associated with masonry. Yes.
I'm also with RIT, and the history that I know of RIT is that it was a formation of the combination of the Mechanics Institute and the Rochester Athenaeum. And I've heard the Rochester Athenaeum dates back to the days of the Erie Canal. Is that something that you came across in your work?
Did not. Okay. It's intriguing, though. This local history. You're fine.
I'm from Medina, and you probably see more of the Medina sandstone than you do cobblestones.
Okay.
There were several Irish people. John Ryan was one of the first one to find the stone, and there are quarries from, I believe, Lockport all the way to almost to Clarendon, where they have quarried the stone for all these buildings around.
That would make sense. Yeah, part of the Niagara escarpment, perhaps, that they did the deep cut through. Yes. The Hoagies are the usually children drivers of the mules along the canal. Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily associate them with a particular immigrant group. They came often from broken families, the death of one or more parents, or dysfunctional families. There's a lot of alcoholism during this particular period of American history. Yes, you're welcome. One more question? appreciate the good discussion. Thank you. I always learn, especially local history, Rochester. I see you really engaged with your community, and what a beautiful place it is. This is really, we were here once during COVID, kind of doing, research, going up and down the canal corridor, but this is my first chance to really come and see this beautiful place. It feels very vibrant and lovely, even more so than Ithaca, and certainly more vibrant than little sleepy Oneonta, where I come from. Yeah, Fairport. I've got a talk coming up in Fairport. I couldn't tell you exactly when it was, but if you're in the Fairport area, keep an eye out for that, and maybe I'll see you there. Yeah.
And we'll see if we can get Mark back in the fall, maybe for
I'd be delighted.
Something related to the Wedding of the Waters. Why don't we take this opportunity to thank Mark Ferrara for an amazing talk here. Thank you all for coming. Stay right there. I just want to see now, since we have some books to give away about students and educators first. Are there students here who would like a copy of the book? Will, I know you, so I got you down already from RIT. Excellent. Other students? How about educators? 1, 2. I know we got some RIT people. 3. David, I'm going to put you down. 4, 5. Okay. So now that's 6 books.
How about appointed government historians?
Appointed government historians.
Of course.
Absolutely. And members of the library. Okay.
Okay, good.
So I think that will take us to about 8 or 9 copies. We have about 6 left. Okay.
Lovely.
1, 2, 3. Okay, so if you were anointed or your hand was up, why don't you meet us at the back table, and Mark Ferrara will sign a copy of the book. Again, thanks to the Public Library, Mark Ferrara, and you for making this great event possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.